Whitaker had a week's leave after boot camp, then 2 months of infantry training through November 1944 at North Carolina's Camp Lejeune. He was shipped to the West Coast on December 1st, a few weeks before General Ushijima lost the 9th Division. Still hoping to be a hero, the wiry lad was almost guaranteed to remain unsung even if he swung it. War's meager proportion of glory to misery was much lower for Americans fighting in the Pacific than in Europe. Location alone ensured them the worst fighting and least recognition. Europe was not only geographically and culturally closer to home, but also far more pleasant. Rare Pacific liberties afforded little to take liberty with. Sand and sun were not much fun when the only change was monsoon-like rain. Even rear areas afforded only a tent for home, insect plagues attacking dirty skin and much disease. So much was nastier on the scorching or humid atolls and islands that a law of military life might have decreed the paradox. Worse treatment for those who already have it worse and more of it, since Pacific fighters' average tour lasted much longer. Actually, a strategic decision was largely responsible for the imbalance. 8 months before Pearl Harbor, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, as the heads of the American services would shortly become, secretly agreed with their British counterparts to focus America's primary effort on Europe if and when she entered the war. Roosevelt and Churchill's first post-Pearl Harbor meetings confirmed that only the minimum of force necessary for the safeguarding of vital interests elsewhere should be diverted from the decisive Atlantic, European theatre. However, Churchill's eloquence influenced Roosevelt. The menace of the Third Reich in occupied Europe justified that decision. Given time, her U-boats might cut communications between America and Britain. With more time, her scientists might produce devastating secret weapons as they did, only slidey too late. The Germany First strategy was sound, but it dedicated less support for the boys in the Pacific, who were facing rougher conditions. It wasn't true, as many of them believed at the time, that their fight was merely a sideshow. But those in Europe did get more supplies, headlines, and applause for fighting their tamer war. Superb as he could be, the German fighting man was an easier enemy than the Japanese, for he fought the ordinary Wehrmacht soldier as opposed to members of the SS and other special units more or less according to the same dictates as the Allied soldier, with more or less the same purpose and limits. With rare exceptions, his goal was to kill others, not to die gloriously. Therefore he surrendered when the odds became hopeless, when there was no sense, in the European understanding, to continued resistance, or his commander surrendered for him. Whole divisions, entire armies of Germans surrendered, but no Japanese. Before Okinawa, only a statistically negligible scattering of Japanese soldiers had been taken prisoner, even after stupefying bombardment and even when there was no point in fighting on except death, which was the point. Just over 1,000 dazed defenders of Iwo Jima's more than 22,000 were eventually captured, but only at the very end of that campaign, roughly a month before the start on Okinawa. Men fought to the death in the most literal sense, often ending with a suicide charge in pursuance of the remotest chance of killing an American before falling. Few veterans of the European theatre could comprehend the implications without personal experience of it. 1 year before, when Imperial General Headquarters had decided it could no longer supply its Rabaul garrison, 100,000 Japanese soldiers were left to fight or starve to death. The few captured unconscious, a former Australian war prisoner wrote not long ago, constantly attempted suicide when they revived in an American or Australian hospital by pulling out IVs, tearing open newly stitched wounds, and even when their hands were tied by trying to bite off their tongues. When symbol-conscious General MacArthur ordered the recapture of Corregidor, some 2,000 of its 3,000 Japanese defenders died by blowing themselves up in an underground arsenal. Like his fellows and superiors unknowingly bound for Okinawa, Dick Whitaker would have had great trouble crediting Japanese culture's very different attitude toward the last debt. In the West in general, and America in particular, death was an irreversible end to a brief earthly appearance, a verdict feared because its sentence was unknown. Tears, repentance, sackcloth and ashes naturally followed, whereas Japanese death was much more tolerable. In both major religions, Buddhism and Shinto, it was more a part of life than its end. It involved much less judgment, let alone final judgment to possible eternal damnation. Few Marines suspected that boot training gave them a better chance than most to grasp Japanese attachment to the community. While Western religion, philosophy, and culture nourished a unique individuality, a sense of self separate from all others, Japanese upbringing forged far more identity with the group. The cherished goal of harmony, could never be achieved by indulgence in individual needs and rarely except through sacrificial pain. Especially in military affairs, Japanese men were prepared to believe that death is lighter than a feather, but duty heavier than a mountain. Thousands of years on their cramped home islands made the almost racially homogeneous Japanese members of one large family in certain ways. This did not preclude savage warring among factions and feudal lords any more than in an actual family. The work patterns of their agricultural society also conditioned its people to see themselves as members of a team. Farming, especially of the all-important rice crop, put a premium on cooperation, not on individuality. Japanese tended to see themselves as seedlings of a crop sprouting indivisibly. To be different was to court instant notice and fearful isolation. If a nail sticks out, went one of the most repeated sayings about upbringing, hammer it in. A close observer suggested almost half a century after the war that to understand Japan's morality one must imagine 12. A situation in which good behavior is constantly determined by individuals' views of how others expect them to behave, in which they can never think, to hell with them, and in which conformity to social expectations is not an unfortunate compromise, but the only possible way to live. Most Japanese were therefore snug in their own society, extremely uncertain and uncomfortable with outsiders, and wont from their earliest years to think of what was defined for them as the common good rather than of self-assertion. This was the soil in which Bushido grew. The way of the warrior was originally established as rules of conduct for samurai, retainers who wielded their swords for feudal lords. Elevating courage, valor, and loyalty, it corresponded in some ways to the chivalric codes for European knights. Bushido stressed self-discipline, reverence for nature, magnanimity, simplicity, modesty, and unquestioned obedience. It was pervaded with gratitude for the blessing of being Japanese. Luxury, display, and boastfulness were very much not the way of the Japanese warrior. To deter all samurai from changing sides, which they had done with some ease in medieval Japan, the notion was introduced that this brought loss of honor, strong discouragement in a society where shame stung painfully. Surrender was also deeply shameful. Suicide was preferable, especially since Japanese culture included no prohibition against it. Harakiri came to be regarded as a highly honorable act, reserved primarily for samurai, at the top of the commoner's social scale. True samurai were never cowardly enough to court or hasten death. Harakiri was appropriate only when every resource had been exhausted and no hope remained to pass yet another test. Since most samurai who actually fought were practical as well as fierce, and the code, like most of them that prescribed knightly virtue in other societies, was constantly ignored, suicide was relatively rare. It was even rarer in the 17th to 19th centuries, when central control became strong enough to stop almost all feudal fighting, and samurai became more bureaucrats than warriors, the committee more powerful than the sword. Still, the practice was celebrated and idealized, chiefly by fervent non-combatants. When the act could be extolled in comfort rather than performed, legends, epics, and plays spread its thrilling virtues among armchair admirers, as American westerns celebrate manly violence. Non-fighting mythmakers, dandies pining for the samurai past, as Ian Buruma recently described them, became more samurai than actual working samurai had been. Bushido was propagated far less by men who had to fight to the death or kill themselves than by comfortable fans of the drama. Although its roots went deep, its modern glorification arose after 3 centuries of peace, when the valorous had little else to do but worry about rules. Appearances and style warriorhood without wars was soon reduced to a set of stylish postures. A strong undercurrent of radical militarism ran close to the surface of Japan's relatively democratic 1910s and the 1920s. When it broke through and pushed the country into her imperialist wars, ultra-nationalists menaced political, social, and cultural life and held up Bushido as a code of national behavior. Never mind that it had been devised for an elite in individual combat, or that it mandated benevolence toward the weak and conquered. Never mind that the feudal code could have rare application in modern combat. The code of Bushido says that a warrior lives so that he is always prepared to die. The outspoken, non-mystical captain of the light cruiser in Yamato's screen told his crew as they got underway. Nothing has been so abused and misinterpreted as this adage. It does not mean that a warrior must commit suicide for some slight reason. It means that we live so that we shall have no regrets when we must die. Death may come to a man at any moment, no matter how he lives. We must not forfeit our lives meaninglessly. But few Japanese knew the origins or understood the concept. From the 1930s onward, it was exploited in the service of the tyrannous 20th century obscurantism that overwhelmed the nation and prosecuted the war. With this distortion, death was elevated from a slim possibility to a civic, or at least a military duty. For half a century, every Japanese schoolchild dedicated himself to his emperor every morning, worshipping at a distance, with bows to His Imperial Majesty's photograph or in the direction of the imperial palace. Assembled classes recited the imperial rescript on education and were asked to name their dearest ambition. The daily reply thundered forth in unison, "To die for the emperor." A manual given each army recruit spoke of living and dying with his fellow soldiers. "Read this alone, and the war can be won," lauded noble death. Corpses drifting swollen in the depths of the sea, corpses rotting in the mountain grass, and described its rewards. All military life resounded with the need to die honorably and the patriotic and spiritual reasons for welcoming it. "Do not be afraid of combat and do not come home alive," was endlessly repeated. "Whether I float as a corpse under the waters or sink beneath the grasses of the mountainside," went a fighting man's hymn, "I will willingly die for the emperor." Johnny, as Russell Spur put it recently, never came marching home. The martial songs left him rotting on some foreign field or dying hopelessly in a futile suicide charge. By now, dying for the country was official policy rather than an expression of volunteer patriotism. Troops were unceasingly reminded that victory of honor or death of honor were their only alternatives, that self-sacrifice was sublime, that willingness to die was essential to the Japanese fighting spirit, which would protect the righteous empire from its evil enemies. "Do not disgrace yourself by being captured alive, but die," exhorted the imperial rescript for soldiers and sailors. Of course, there were degrees of belief in this. It was iron among the army's backbone of academy graduates, men like Mitsuru Ushijima and Tadashi Kojo. One such junior officer was wounded during the China War. A young Chinese officer who had studied under him when posted to Japan for instruction recognized him lying in a trench. He saw to it that his still unconscious former instructor was delivered to a hospital. The rescued man killed himself after his release to atone for the shame of his capture. Cadet Kojo was moved by the wholly understandable defense of his honor. The belief was weaker among reserve officers, still weaker among the drafted rank and file, weakest among unmotivated nonconformists, softies and recent conscripts who had hoped to escape the draft. A soldier on Okinawa, who was among the handful of his battalion's survivors, would remember the Japanese people as wearing two faces during the war's final years. The one turned to others around them, said, "Tight and die for the country." The other, turned inward and shared by the family, said, "Don't die, survive at all costs and come home." Those who did return home to find tear-soaked telegrams mistakenly informing family of their death realized that their parents were not the uncompromising patriots they had pretended to be. Norio Watanabe, the draftee from Osaka ordered to lick the spot of excrement from his boot on Okinawa, bought no part of Bushido at all. Nothing in army life or philosophy appealed to the former photojournalist, who had fervently hoped his bottom-of-the-barrel draft category would keep him a civilian. Just before Pearl Harbor, a fellow journalist risked a treason charge to urge him not to die in the likely imminent war with America, but Watanabe already knew how silly that would be. Photographing for Osaka's General Motors division 3 years earlier, he had viewed a company film. Images of GM's mighty Detroit plants was enough for the misfit to see immediately what the army brass could never grasp. Taking on America would be madness. Watanabe's slight size protected him from call-ups into early 1944, but everything he saw of the war as a civilian further convinced him of that madness. He was summoned to a police station one day to explain a young nephew's behavior. The boy had been caught strolling in a park without his gaiters. "This is a time of national emergency," lashed the outraged police. "Our soldiers are dying at the front." The incident took place in traditionally liberal Osaka, whose merchants used to disparage the military. Watanabe had to apologize abjectly. He was 30 years old when his despised draft notice finally came, a year before the start of the fighting on Okinawa. Clenching his teeth during basic training to keep them from being broken, he quickly realized that the real reason for his beatings was the army's conviction that fear was the best teacher of obedience. "The beaten lose their minds," he observed, concluding that loss of mind had got Japan into the war in the first place. Kenjiro Matsuki was another exception. When Kenjiro was a boy, a kindly uncle had supplied him with baseballs fished from a stream that ran from an athletic field to the uncle's little farm in Honshu's impoverished north, across the Sea of Japan from Vladivostok. Later, Matsuki's strapping size by Japanese standards and his love of baseball introduced to Japan in the 1870s, 2 decades after Commodore Perry's visit won him a scholarship to Tokyo's Meiji University, free room and board and a few yen in pocket money. The team was invited to play a series against American universities in 1929, an exciting experience for the big first baseman. He later played on an all-Nippon team that hosted a series against Lou Gehrig and other stars, and spent part of the summer of 1931 in Hawaii, where he danced with a young woman, something he might never have done in Japan outside dance halls with paid hostesses. Matsuki played for Japan's first professional baseball team when it was formed in 1935. He went from the Hanshin Tigers captain to assistant manager and finally to manager in 1940 and 1941. Happy memories of America deepened his sadness at the news of Pearl Harbor. What foolishness to extend the war, already far into China, to mighty America. Of course, he never voiced his opinion. A report to the military police would have put him in serious trouble. But Matsuki's first-hand knowledge of America was very rare among Japanese soldiers, and uncommonly individualist Watanabe would demonstrate on Okinawa that he was an even more rare exception. Although few ordinary Japanese soldiers believed the whole of their military indoctrination, most preferred death to the intolerable shame of surrender. The sullen, broken sprinkling who did surrender in Pacific battles preceding Okinawa were convinced they could never return disgracefully alive to face the humiliation awaiting them in Japan, where their names would have been stricken from their villages' lists, their manhood forever effaced. Those who had died in a suicide attack or clutching a grenade to their chests, however, were generously rewarded. Their spirits went to Tokyo's celebrated Yasukuni Shrine, the Patriots' Shrine or Shrine of the Righteous Souls, where they began a better life mingling with the spirits of other heroes and achieved a closeness to the emperor beyond their aspirations while alive. Americans took this for fanaticism, but it may have been closer to a poetic passion that welled up beneath the reserved Japanese countenance. It was a triumph of emotion over logic, like Japan's very decision to attack America. But whatever its source, the heightened willingness to die was among the factors that made the Pacific War supremely brutal. Soldiers everywhere continued killing until they were beaten. The Japanese soldier was not beaten until he was killed. Willingness to die also helped explain the atrocities against Allied prisoners of war. Another Japanese trait also played a part. The tendency to sense no restraints when dealing with foreigners, the not-quite-human Gaijin who fell outside their own community's highly sensitivity to the complex webbing of duties, debts and obligations that governed their society, all involving nuances and subtleties and rules that varied with time and place. It is almost essential, as Ian Baruma observed, to be brought up as a Japanese in order to acquire this sensitivity, to have one's brains plugged into the social computer bank, as it were. The code is internalized in the same way that Christian morality is internalized in most Westerners. But when a Japanese is unplugged, by going abroad for instance, the computer can go berserk. For unlike Christian morality, the Japanese code is not thought to be universal, it applies only to Japanese. On top of this, many Japanese soldiers despised prisoners for allowing themselves to be taken. Some believed beheading was an act of compassion that ended their intolerable disgrace. How much better to give a prisoner a manly death than to prolong his final degradation of the male spirit? It was easy for Americans in 1944 to see Japanese as inherently savage. The handful who knew something about their culture could cite the glorified barbarities, steel swords, slashing human bone that ran through Japanese history. But the country hadn't always mistreated prisoners of war. Defeated enemies sometimes received true Bushido's consideration and courtesy, as in the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, when treatment of Russian prisoners was often exemplary. In this war, however, Japan was far more brutal than Germany to American prisoners of war. However savage the Nazi occupation was to civilian populations, however Soviet and East European prisoners suffered, Germany treated many Western prisoners of war tolerably, no doubt in part because the thousands of Wehrmacht soldiers in Allied hands were an incentive to observe her obligations as a Geneva Convention signatory. But Japan lost few prisoners to the Allies and cared little for those despicable cowards. The Empire held far fewer American than other Allied prisoners, principally English and Dutch soldiers and colonial administrators captured during her lightning seizures of European colonies in the months following Pearl Harbor. Over 1 million had died or were painfully dying in their gruesome camps. Disease and starvation claimed most of them. Others were beaten, beheaded and bayoneted, sometimes when tied between posts. There was also a range of unspeakable tortures. Tokugawa Japan in 1853, poor, proud and afraid, was about as different as a human society can be from plebeian, acquisitive, overconfident America. Murray Sale. We pray God that our present attempt to bring a singular and isolated people into the family of civilized nations may succeed without resort to bloodshed. Commodore Matthew C. Perry's journal entry of the 9th of July, 1853, the day after he arrived off Edo Bay. What caused that barbarity? Few Americans had any notion of the ripe hatreds in the Japanese memory. Raw pride imagined some racial slurs, but others were real. There was good reason to be galled by American demonstrations of superiority, including opposition to Japan's wish for a racial equality clause in the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. In the states, Orientals were made ineligible for citizenship. California and other states segregated their schoolchildren and denied their parents the right to own land. The 1924 Exclusion Act was directed specifically against immigration from Japan, even though a gentleman's agreement 16 years earlier had virtually ended it. Such gratuitous insults demonstrated that the Yellow Peril was at least as much in the American mind as in geopolitical reality. The humiliations had begun earlier, at an episode hailed in American history and reviled in Japanese. When Matthew Calbraith Perry arrived in Japan in July 1853, 88 years before Pearl Harbor, the country had been closed almost hermetically for over 2 centuries. Sealed borders kept foreigners from entering and natives from leaving or returning if they had been resident abroad. The crime of building anything larger than a fishing boat was punishable by death. The entrenched isolation magnified the terrifying spectre of Perry's warships in Tokyo Bay. A letter from Millard Fillmore, the Commodore's well-meaning president, assured the Japanese Emperor of Americans' good intentions. His tolerant, democratic, peace-loving republic recognized Japan's right to govern herself without the slightest interference. But Japan's closure had led her occasionally to fire on foreign ships in distress, including an unarmed American merchantman 16 years earlier, and to mistreat seamen shipwrecked on rocky coasts, aliens who had violated the prohibition against entry. Although few were now killed, many were beaten. Perry had come to end that inhumanity and, incidentally, to secure coaling facilities for American ships and opportunities for her traders. His demands included nothing for the Japanese to resent, providing Christianity was presumed the highest good, for the Secretary of the Navy had confided that the mission's motive was to awaken the Japanese to their Christian obligation to join the family of Christendom. Nothing to resent, presuming that good was served by opening a sovereign nation to America's economic, religious, and national interests. Washington's ideals were as enlightened as any of the time. It believed no nation had a right, for her own sake as well as for the common good, to exclude herself from progress, international trade, the rewards of science. But those good Christians did not rely on moral suasion to convince the heathen. They brought big guns. Blinking at them, the Japanese could not fully appreciate their visitors' benevolence. They knew Westerners had forced their way into China just 14 years earlier, and that the British, annoyed by attempts to restrict the importation of opium, instigated the Opium War, and easily triumphed with their modern weapons. The Chinese Empire's virtual disintegration quickly followed, foreigners extracting concession after concession from the rump. That recent history hardly helped Japanese recognize Perry's arrival as a gift of enlightenment rather than a threat. It was a devastating blow to national honor in a country where avoiding slights, not to mention blows of that force, was almost as important as food. Perry's demands were moderate, at least in comparison with those the British, Dutch, French, and Russians would make in his wake. Japan would surely have been compelled to bow more deeply if a Russian force, dispatched by Nicholas I, one of Christendom's great despots, had arrived first, which it failed to do by a mere 6 weeks. Since someone was going to pry the country open very soon, better the young republic than the cynical European powers that negotiated more arrogantly and mined concessions more greedily. But it was Americans who arrived first and began the process. An old Japanese folk song had warned of a black ship, an alien thing of evil mien. 2 of Perry's black-hulled ships also belched black smoke, the colour by which the vessels instantly became known and remained known by every schoolchild of succeeding generations. The Japanese had never seen steamships. The shore batteries had no hope against Perry's cannon. The country was submerged in panic and dismay. It would not figure much in Japanese memory that Perry's squadron played a crucial part in the country's liberation from an often cruel feudalism whose borders were closed to tighten the ruler's domination. What most Japanese would remember is that the trespassers got their way through superior might. The invasion force of black ships became a national metaphor for menacing, humiliating foreign trespass on sacred Japan, a constant reminder, as Japanese saw it, that others wished her ill. Their first sight of Western civilizers down the barrel of American guns fed their sense of themselves as being under pressure from the rest of the world, led by the United States. Japan would undergo huge, often convulsive, changes before she began slashing and conquering in 1931. Roots deep in her own history and national psyche fed her glorification of militarism and urge to subjugate others. Quite enough, Japanese believed the sword of the samurai was the soul of the nation well before the Commodore arrived, and when gunpowder was introduced, they took to it like the Hebrews to manna. Still, Perry's presumption and amazing cannon spurred Japanese impatience to build their own. The remarkable lesson learners mastered this one splendidly. They had good reason to believe that unless they could copy the barbarians' military technology, they would suffer more such humiliations, maybe even be carved up into economic colonies, as Western powers were about to do to much of the rest of Asia. The black ships were never forgotten. Their memory helped feed an appetite for conquest that would end in the Pacific War, when the emotional people, overwhelmed by their rages and fears, perceived Americans as provocative symbols of a detested past, rather than as human beings. A cartoon celebrating Pearl Harbor depicted a dismayed Uncle Sam uncorking a giant samurai from a bottle. Revenge for Japan's forced opening. From a barbarous prisoner of war camp, Lawrence van der Post perceived Japan's response as a kind of accumulated revenge of history on the European for his invasion of the ancient worlds of the East and his arrogant assumptions of superiority which had made him use his power to bend the lives and spirits of the people of Asia to the Europeans' inflexible will. Many Japanese temporarily forgot that Europe, meanwhile, had brought her much good. All that mattered was that since Perry's arrival, the proud people had been forced to live a kind of tranced life in the presence of the European, who prevented them from being their own special selves, with their greatness and illusions. But now the spell was broken, van der Post observed, and the built-up flood of resentment had broken through all restraints. Out in full spate, in the open at last, it swept the Japanese, normally so disciplined, but now drunk on what appeared to be invincible military power, into a chaotic mood of revenge. Worst of all, it was self-righteous revenge, but it could not fully explain the barbarity because more was directed toward impoverished fellow Asians than toward high-handed Westerners. Japan's behavior on the Asian continent in the 1930s and 1940s was far more savage than the worst Western colonialism had been. The Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, its hoaxing title for the conquered lands where it sloshed blood and sucked sustenance, spilled over with atrocities. Japanization of inferior Asians included slapping faces in public and massacring citizens. Some 10 million, mostly civilian Chinese alone, were murdered. The conquerors provided an almost spellbinding spectacle of brutality and death, as a historian recently put it. In 1937, respected Tokyo newspapers duly or falsely reported a friendly competition by two officers to be quickest in beheading 150 Chinese with their samurai swords. As for Americans, Japanese hatred waxed as the war situation worsened. By 1944, magazines were telling their readers that the more American who were sent to hell, the cleaner the world will be. Classroom posters exhorted pupils to kill the Americans. Kill they did. A prisoner of the Japanese was 7 times as likely to perish as a prisoner in the European camps of the Axis, and the statistics were worse for Americans alone. 1% of American prisoners of war of the Germans died, 40% of the Japanese. One of the living, who happened to be a knowledgeable admirer of Japanese culture, was made to watch soldiers taking bayonet practice on live prisoners tied between bamboo posts, and to witness executions for obscure reasons like showing a spirit of willfulness or not bowing with sufficient alacrity in bamboo, the direction of the rising sun. I would never have thought it possible that in our time there could still have been so many different ways of killing people, from cutting off their heads with swords, bayoneting them in various ways, to strangling them and burying them alive, but most significantly, never by just shooting them. The Imperial Army's Wake Island garrison shot over 100 American construction workers who had been building airstrips when the Japanese landed in 1941, then claimed that the workers had died during American bombardments. Japanese pilots shot American rivals dangling in parachutes after bailing out. Their submarines sank a fraction of the tonnage sent under by American submarines, but Allied merchant sailors struggling in the water faced much greater danger. After a Japanese ship transporting American prisoners of war to the mainland was torpedoed, guards struggling to stay afloat machine-gunned prisoners nearby in the water. Many of the prisoners would have died anyway in airless holds that drove them literally crazy with thirst. Within days of the 10th of October raid on Naha, a Japanese submarine's crew laughingly fired pistols and machine guns into the lifeboats of a Liberty ship it had just sunk. The historian John Toland has argued that the Japanese-American War would not have been fought if not for the mutual misunderstanding and distrust, language difficulties and racial prejudice, irrationality, honor, pride and fear among both peoples. Toland produced much evidence to show that both sides feared things they need not have feared. We were damn fools like they were damn fools. It's enough to make you sick. But even the disastrous mistranslations of diplomatic communications he tellingly cites cannot expunge what did have to be feared. Americans were indeed damn fools, full of rigidity and self-righteous ignorance of the Orient, full of stupid, swaggering insults. But that was the principal cause neither of the Pacific War nor of its most awful excesses. Whitaker's 2 months of infantry training in Camp Lejeune had far less hazing than boot camp. The trainees were now Marines. His transfer to the West Coast in early December 1944, just as the 32nd Army on Okinawa was redeploying after the loss of the 9th Division, was a week-long train ride that featured 24-hour pinochle games. The impatient young men believed that no humans had ever been packed together so tightly while outside stretched the West's awesome vastness, a new spectacle to almost all of the little-travelled youth. The great expanse confirmed their country as the world's most beautiful, blessed and deserving. Underlying their attitude was a conviction that Americans were the most industrious, virtuous people, better than all others, immeasurably better than the dirty little buck-toothed Japanese. There was also an assumption, as the journalist Murray Sale recently expressed it, that the whole human race is actually made up of Americans, or at least potential Americans, who need only liberation or enlightenment to behave like Americans, a counterpart to the Japanese conviction that Japan was unique and superior. More than ever in love with their land of the free, the young warriors en route to California complained about their conditions but wouldn't have traded places for anything with the soft civilians who were going to miss the great fight. Righteous vengeance beckoned. The 18-year-olds knew little of the long nightmare of Japanese treatment of prisoners of war, but what Whitaker had learned was enough to make him wonder whether Hitler was the worst enemy after all. Several months after the Philippines had fallen to Japan in April 1942, the U.S. Army learned the fate of prisoners taken there from 3 escaped officers who managed to make their way to Australia. Officials kept the information secret for fear that surviving prisoners would suffer reprisals. Only in January 1944 did the American public learn that men dying of thirst were stopped alongside wells and forbidden to drink, that others barely able to stand were booted and beaten, that an officer's finger was hacked off when he refused to surrender his wedding ring, that prisoners were forced to bury their comrades alive, and that over 600 Americans and at least 10 times as many Filipinos too exhausted to keep pace on a march from Bataan to a prison compound were clubbed, shot, buried and bayoneted to death. Almost 400 Filipinos were hacked to pieces one day for no apparent reason at all. There were some slight extenuating circumstances. Despite the admirable treatment of Russian prisoners in 1905, Japan's history was full of clan wars that ended in the gruesome slaughter of the last man of the losing side, sometimes women and children too. Now, with beatings so important in the modern Japanese army, it seemed natural to beat the enemy as well, especially those miserable cowards who had surrendered their dignity and manhood by allowing themselves to be taken alive. It is possible that the guards were unaware that many prisoners couldn't continue marching because they were close to starvation and racked with malaria, dysentery and other debilitating diseases. It is now clear that at least some of the killing was unintentional. Preoccupied with their attack plans and hard-pressed to supply their own weary, hungry units, Japanese staffs had failed to prepare for the surprising to them number who surrendered. Still, deliberate cruelty abounded, and Japanese soldiers delighted in it. Flies feasted on countless headless corpses in ditches. One American lieutenant was lashed to a telephone pole for his decapitation. His body was left dangling in the sun. American newspapers, in turn, blistered with disgust, outrage and confirmation that the inhuman, barbarous, depraved enemy was a bestial force from some headquarters of evil. The cycle of kill or be killed widened the emotional gap between the Pacific and European wars. Everyone knew some Germans were good, but Japanese were a racial menace as well as a dangerous enemy. Cartoons depicted them as mad dogs and hairy tarantulas rightly squashed by a combat boot. A magazine for Marines called Leatherneck specified who the good ones were in a caption under a large photograph of Japanese corpses. Good Japanese. Keep them dying. Whitaker read about the Bataan Death March when it was almost 2 years past, but the details gripped him like nothing in Europe and remained fresh in his mind as the train neared San Diego. He knew he'd be facing a devious, cruel, bloodthirsty enemy, maybe worse than the Germans, but he didn't yet know how they fought. He nurtured an assumption that the bow-legged runts in the sloppy uniforms, baggy trousers, wrinkled coats, ridiculous puttees couldn't possibly be a match for his spit and posh, rough and very ready Marines. Many Marines would sustain such bravado-laced illusions, part of what kept them damn fools about the Orient all the way to front lines on Okinawa. Replacements for badly shot-up companies would be rushed in during lulls, and with no time to acquire combat smarts, a shocking number of those green troops would themselves become casualties within hours. Their new platoon leaders tried hard to save them. One hurriedly lectured a new group of bewildered replacements as they huddled together against murderous Japanese fire from the hill nicknamed Sugarloaf. Aching with exhaustion and shock from that day's loss of friends, the young platoon leader, up from the ranks after all his officers had been shot, concluded by pointing his pistol at the greenhorns. "And if I hear any bullshit about the Japanese being lousy fighters, I'll shoot you," he said. "If one of you says they can't shoot straight, I'll put a bullet between your eyes before they do." To distinguish it from earlier days, Love, in American military parlance, was chosen to denote the April first landing on Okinawa. Nothing as grim and breathtaking had been unleashed in the history of the Pacific. Nothing similar is likely to be seen again. This landing was even more impressive than the much-documented Normandy operation the previous June, most of whose ships, although marginally more in number, had to travel only the width of the English Channel. Operation Iceberg, an undertaking of the same immense scale, took place 6,200 miles from San Francisco, 4,000 miles from Pearl Harbor. Many days sailing from supply depots and anchorages the Navy had established closer to the target. So vast was the operation A military historian summed up that the forces were staged and assembled across the breadth of the Pacific, from the west coast to Hawaii, the Marianas, Leyte, Espiritu Santo, and Guadalcanal. The movement of mountains of goods and equipment, from aircraft engines to drinking water to millions of candy bars, was an extraordinary feat in itself, and no secondary one, since the American way of war relied on colossal quantities of supplies. A Marine unit crammed on an LST was dismayed to discover that the supplies included stacks of white crosses in the cargo spaces. 22,000 tons of supplies had been delivered daily to Iwo Jima during the fighting just ended there, only 15% of the daily total that would be arriving on Okinawa. 25 ships carried jeeps alone. In 2 days, supply ships managed to transfer more cargo to fighting ships at sea than a port the size of Boston handled in a week. It took prodigious staff work to organize and coordinate the supplying, loading and sailing of the vast array of vessels, with all their specialized personnel and equipment, so that they would arrive on time for their ocean rendezvous. Love Day was the consummation of a stunning exercise in military logistics. If the purpose had been show, the operation would have entered history's hit parade of man-made spectacles. No fewer than 1457 ships and over 500,000 men participated in what a British observer called the most audacious and complex enterprise yet undertaken by the American amphibious forces. Whitaker got his first inkling of its magnitude after his convoy joined a larger one but still a fraction of the whole at night. He went topside in the morning and blinked. There were ships to the horizon, a truly awesome number. I couldn't have imagined that many ships existed in the world. 430 of them were troop ships. Their union with the largest armada ever assembled in the Pacific awed every man aboard. Some of those ships had long service records, others came straight from their shakedown cruises. They had sailed from 11 ports, from Seattle to Pearl Harbor to Ulithi, an atoll 3,700 miles west of Hawaii that provided a fine anchorage and base for forward operations. Their number covered 30 square miles of ocean. Although no man could see more than a fraction of the whole, what he did see brought relief that someone somewhere knew what he was doing. Getting all those ships with their specialized equipment and personnel to arrive all at one time at a dot in the Pacific gave us confidence. Maybe we'd be all right. There were battleships, cruisers, more cruisers you wouldn't believe it, another said. We were in the middle of a phenomenal amount of floating iron, and, just for the hell of it, or to convince myself I wasn't dreaming, I started counting the ships. It was impossible. Too many of them, just too unbelievably many. And I felt myself smiling inside. Maybe I'd be hit on this Okinawa where we were going, but there was no way we could lose with that incredible number of ships. The submarine fleet alone, Task Force 17, contributed over 50 vessels, some of which had landed advance parties to prepare the beaches. The 21st Bomber Command contributed over 300 B-29s. The aircraft carriers of Task Force 58, which engaged Yamato 1 week later, supplied more than 1,500 additional planes, many of which had bombed targets on Okinawa for 10 days before L-Day. The fighting ships made up the largest assembly in naval history, over 40 carriers, 18 battleships, scores of cruisers, and almost 150 destroyers and destroyer escorts. These 318 combat vessels were roughly thrice the number the Imperial Japanese Navy had committed to the crucial Battle of Midway in June 1942, risking most of its fighting strength. The American ships had poured fire onto Okinawa, especially on and around the landing sites, for 6 full days and much of their nights. The pre-invasion bombardment by ships and planes set a pattern for most Japanese on the island that they would follow until each man's death. As Colonel Yahara had planned, they hid underground during the day and sneaked out to do errands later, to fight at night. Our activities begin in the evening, when the worst of the air raids are over, a surviving soldier recorded, cooking, drawing water, washing and, more important, receiving more ammunition and moving our weapons. Transferring the sick and injured to medical facilities, all this must be done when naval bombardments keep cutting into everything, making us break into a cold sweat when the shells hit. Still, it's the Garden of Eden itself when no planes are overhead. Let's go! The demon's gone! Out we jump from our cave, run the tiny path to the foot of the mountain to find the small trench where our ammunition is hidden. It's dark on the return trip. We trace our way back to the cave, heavy ammunition cases on our backs, frantic to make it back inside quickly. Naval shells burst all around us. "Look out!" I say to myself, but the burden on my back would keep me from hitting the ground even if I tried. I flatten myself against the side of the rocky hill and wait for the shelling to stop, feeling the whole time as if my soul is wearing out. It's totally unsafe outside the cave, even when the demons aren't flying above. Japanese soldiers who had believed nothing could be worse than the first air raid of the previous October realized they were mistaken when a series of equally powerful raids hit them day after day in January 1945. Again, they believed nothing could be worse until the pre-invasion bombardment. They were mistaken yet again. Worse came on L-Day itself. In the small hours of April 1st, the support ships and 564 carrier-based aircraft began raking 8 miles of Okinawan beaches with the greatest bombardment by far in the history of the long Pacific campaign. 10 great battleships pounded the shore with their main batteries of 14 and 16-inch guns. Smaller broadsides from their secondary batteries and from 9 cruisers, 23 destroyers, and almost 200 gunships added to the enormous weight of metal. Almost 45,000 16, 14, 12, 8, 6, and 5-inch shells, plus 33,000 rockets and 22,500 mortar shells. Statistics are of course meaningless, except to suggest that both sides felt the world was exploding with the biggest thing yet attempted in the Pacific, this mightiest naval force the world had ever seen, this heaviest concentration of naval gunfire ever to support a landing of American troops, as described by the battle's historians. The 10 battleships alone could send 120 tons of high explosive onto Okinawa every minute, and all 10 sustained their ferocity for 3 hours, flattening large circles of water with their shock waves, racking ears with their roar. For half a mile inland from the beach, about 25 rounds landed on every 100 square yards, which were also hit by planes, some using napalm. The air itself seemed to pulsate. The smell, smoke, and head-splitting noise of previous amphibious landings had been stupendous. This was more, the most. Then it stopped, still in pre-dawn darkness. At 4:06, the commander of the amphibious operation gave the traditional order to land the landing force. "We've all seen amphibious landings in the movies," a young naval officer wrote home, "but the real thing is more spectacular than anything I ever dreamed of." The officer's vantage point was his landing ship Medium, which was launching Sherman tanks in huge flotation collars for their trip to shore. The precision bombing of the beachhead by scores of planes, the monotonous shelling of the shoreline by the huge wagons, the wave after wave of LVTs, small boats, etc., heading into the island constituted a display so formidable and awe-inspiring, I shall never forget it. It seemed so much like a tremendous dream. One couldn't feel fear. I'm thankful I had the opportunity to see it all from my grandstand seat in the pilot house. The spectacle impressed the enemy too. A Japanese soldier reported from an observation post commanding a view of the landing that, "You can't make out the ocean color because of the enemy ships." A moment later, he made a conscientious correction. "I take that back. It's 70% ships, 30% ocean." When the morning mist lifted, a member of an anti-aircraft unit saw a magnificent battle pageant under the sun. The start of the ferocious bombardment seemed like thousands of industrial plants all switching on their machinery together. Soon the landing area from the water to a mile inland was too covered by smoke as heavy as a volcanic eruption to make out the shore. John Lardner reported the natives as somewhat bemused by all this nonsense that could only have been prompted by ignorance of Okinawans and of real war. Despite Lardner's reputation as a New Yorker war correspondent, the natives were actually full of foreboding. Since heavy American aerial reconnaissance revealed almost nothing about the Japanese positions underground, most of the pre-landing bombardment had no specific targets. Therefore, the majority of shells landed at random or slammed into civilian buildings. One Okinawan saw the torrent as a bulldozer able to wipe out everything on Earth. It felt as if the whole island of Okinawa would be pulverized and blown away. The giant fleet's week of bombarding was so much more menacing than the Okinawans had expected that all but the excitedly pro-Japanese kept themselves from thinking about it as they sheltered in caves during the day and tried to repair, provision, or evacuate after dark. For civilians, too, a routine that would last until the end of the campaign was already established, hiding and sleeping by day and trying to find provisions or new hiding places by night. Shuei Ikamiyagi, a Naha librarian conscripted into the Home Guard and later proclaimed a private second class, the lowest grade in the Imperial Army, summed up the temper of the civilian majority, who hoped for the promised Japanese victory and tried to believe it would not cost them everything. The mood in his cave tended to be gloomy and miserable. Some recently conscripted fellow Okinawans cried themselves to sleep, worrying about their families. Others chattered aimlessly. Still others remained stone silent. Most wondered whether the imminent landing would bring their death. We spent the last week of March like criminals on death row. The instrument of execution was there, all ready for us. The only difference was that it was the American fleet instead of an axe or noose, and no time was set for the execution. But it was only a matter of time. It had to come sooner or later. That's what we felt somewhere in our minds. We tried to suppress it and started to chatter a lot of nonsense. When no actual fear of death lurks nearby, we humans talk of it with composure, even laugh at it, but we stop mentioning death when it lies right in front of us. Most Japanese soldiers were distinctly tougher. It was a tribute to their training, bravery, and supreme commitment that the sight of the enemy armada, while impressing them with its size and impudence for steaming so nonchalantly into Japanese waters, neither seized them with fear nor informed them of the battle's inevitable end. That training, implemented amid the national hypnosis, was also what blinded 99 in 100 to how Japan's war had been ravaging others and why it couldn't possibly be won, blinded them even to evidence before their eyes. For many gazed with satisfaction at the immensely powerful fleet. They were pleased to see so many enemy vessels gathered for convenient destruction by Imperial planes and warships. Much of the pageant was so massively more violent than anything the Americans had seen that most had moments of intense exhilaration. The smoke, smell, and thunder of naval salvo after ear-splitting salvo were not merely stupendous but stupefying, overpowering. The din of some brass shell cases clattering on one ship's steel deck, deafened, like 1,000 cymbals falling down stone steps, remembered one man who waited for the order to enter his landing boat. But the troops readying themselves to climb down the nets to the boats would have been happy to tolerate 10 times that noise. The first 24 hours on Iwo Jima 6 weeks earlier had cost 5,500 American casualties. More were expected on Okinawa, whose strategically more valuable territory was 1/3 closer to the mainland and also a Japanese prefecture rather than merely a possession. Rumor correctly had it that intelligence predicted L-Day casualties of 80 to 85%, for which extra medical teams were going in with the first waves. Those troops were therefore grateful for every bomb, bullet, and rocket of this heaviest bombardment ever to support an amphibious landing. The infantrymen shouldered their weapons and backpacks and pulled themselves over the side, many carrying 100 pounds of supplies and equipment. Sailors watched with a combination of camaraderie and relief that they didn't have to face the morning's carnage. Although shared suffering and hatred of Japan did not end inter-service brawling in less tense moments, the ship's crews now felt their hearts pull toward the men climbing down the nets. On USS Baxter, a 20-year-old carpenter's mate, whose job would be to repair hit landing craft, watched with compassion. You bet I felt sorry for them. You bet I wouldn't have wanted to join them. They didn't show fear, but how could they not have had it? As the huge roar of amphibious craft engines joined the gunfire thunder, sweat broke out on drawn faces. Even veterans of previous landings fought terror, or especially such veterans. This was John McMuhin's 5th. So I figured this had to be my time to get it. I'd been too lucky so far. I don't know the words to explain how it is to be in combat, another veteran later apologized. I was afraid, frightened and scared each time we jumped off the landing boats. And another. Frankly, one of my nightmare moments was always related to the landing on the beach or being shot out of the water. A third. For myself, I must confess that from chow at 3 a.m. till I climbed into the landing craft, it seemed I would explode from severe nervous tension. April 1st was Ed Jones's birthday. I knew about Iwo. I thought I might have a very short 19th year. Still, fear was only one of the emotions gripping the men as they squeezed into the bobbing landing boats, breathing their oily exhaust. Another was relief to be off the motherships. Whitaker's crossing from the States to his Russell Island staging area, then to Guadalcanal and Okinawa, was typical. In San Diego, he had been packed into a Liberty troopship for a voyage whose first leg alone took a month. Steel decks turned scorching under the equatorial sun. The hastily built or converted tubs with their troughs for latrines were torture for men squeezed together in the reek of sweat, urine, and vomit. A deck officer reckoned, "You wouldn't treat sardines that way." The final 4 or 5 days had been one endless line for chow tasting like sea rations tossed into greasy cauldrons. Some army troopships fed their passengers once a day, causing near rebellion among Marines who happened to have been crammed aboard among army units. Many troops truly preferred landing and fighting the devil himself, and surely the devilish Japanese, to spending another 24 hours in buckets whose gagging conditions grew worse on the final leg to Okinawa, when the fringe of a typhoon badly tossed hundreds of them, making a fetid mess of their lower decks. Most all-day breakfasts had been the traditional pre-landing feast of steak and eggs, all they wanted, but many men could manage only a few mouthfuls. At 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, with the thunder of the naval guns reminding the men that many would be dead in the next few hours, it was too much like a convict's last meal. The general who stated that Liberty ship transport serves well in preparation for the hardships ahead might have added that it also helped reduce reluctance to leave it for beaches on which machine gun nests, pillbox guns, and dreaded artillery were zeroed in. Even without the torment of the voyage, some aggressive teenagers without wives and children to consider would have been impatient. As Paul Fussell recently pointed out, combat's compensations, the thrill of comradeship, the excitements of the chase, the exhilarations of surprise, deception, and the ruse de guerre, the exaltations of success, the sheer fun of prankish irresponsibility, console young men more than older ones. Sheer fun would be rare on Okinawa, but older men shared with teenagers confidence in their training and certainty of victory. Deep pride in belonging to their units and an almost bodily satisfaction of righteous unity fed eagerness for the battle that was simultaneously feared. A mess sergeant in a tank battalion had paid $50 to his first sergeant in order not to be stuck in his rear echelon unit on Guam and left out of the fighting. A more impoverished buddy of his stowed away in order to be with his unit and was later court-martialed for his initiative. After training endlessly for combat and absorbing all the indoctrination that went with the physical part of it, not to participate would have been a terrible letdown as well as a lucky break. To stay behind for some reason while buddies faced the test brought self-contempt. In the hour before the battle, fear that one's own arms and legs might be among those soon to be blown off was exceeded by fear of failing in the eyes of the others and that others would see the fear. As much as anything, that had been the purpose of their training, to make them perceive the danger as less fearsome than alternatives. An infantryman preparing to land in the first wave later spoke for almost everyone alongside him. "I think my biggest fear wasn't of getting hurt because, like everybody else, until he's been in the line for weeks and knows this is pure bullshit, I was certain getting hurt is what happens to the other guys. This is crazy. But my biggest fear was whether the guy alongside me could tell what was happening in my stomach and whether I'd do something shameful when we hit the beach. I joined up to fight Japanese and be a hero, but will I have what it takes?" a friend added. Somewhere I was scared out of my mind, but also scared that the guys next to me would see that. In short, fear and apprehension were private emotions, shared but also covered up. I wasn't just tense, I was scared, half dizzy, a young infantryman remembered. But even more than that, I was determined that nobody would see I was worried about anything. I think the main thing was not to show your buddy how frightened you were. "You were more afraid of how you'd hold up under fire than of the fire itself," said another. "You prayed you wouldn't panic. You hoped like hell your landing craft would somehow never reach the beach, yet also hoped it was already there so you could get it over with. And it was like a wide receiver going out for a pass. He wants the ball to come to him and at the same time is scared that he'll drop it or get hit hard and fumble. And most important, you'd been trained never to let your buddies down. You knew how terrible that would be, so your fear of getting killed wasn't as bad as having to spend the rest of your life with your tail between your legs if you did let them down a failure, a coward. Buck Private Thomas Hanaher felt dumb for having voluntarily surrendered his asthma, caused 4F draft classification with the neat lie at his second medical examination in North Dakota, and choosing the Marines on top of that. Dumb, one of the stupidest things I've done in my life. Everyone had seen films of the landings at Tarawa and other islands. Someone in his artillery battery had a radio and was listening to news about Iwo Jima. That was when you decided God was worth knowing, and it was a good idea to write some last letters. Because you knew this would probably be even worse than Iwo. You knew you'd be a casualty soon. That was just the law of averages. The lucky ones had missed Tokyo Rose 3 days earlier, broadcasting, "For you men standing off the shores of Okinawa, because many of you will never hear another program. Here's some music to remind you of darlings, jazz, home, and mother." Hanaher realized this day might well be his last, though another part of him knew that wasn't possible. Resolution grappled with self-pity. Why did he have to be there that day? If he'd had an option, he certainly would have chosen to return to Guam. But without that option, he wanted to do his job. He still had to prove himself, and what better way? I both hated the thought of being killed and wanted to be in combat. I was scared as hell, but also proud to be with those going in now. I desperately hoped I wouldn't let anyone down. I was going to do this thing, and if I got through it, which I doubted, maybe life would be different when I got home. Love of country was a given as night gave way to morning. All felt uplifted by belonging to their blessed, righteous homeland, but flag and country became abstract as the new day broke. What held mind and body together at hour was their sense of duty to their buddies, those squeezed in right beside them, and the unwillingness to lose face in their eyes. Needless to say, however, not even the intense tribal closeness cemented by the shared danger eclipsed all human nastiness. When Hanaher returned to his LST compartment after a few bites of the steak and eggs breakfast, he found that his Browning automatic rifle ammunition had been swiped from his bunk, leaving him to face his first combat landing with no bullets. He was lucky to steal parts of others' bandoliers before landing. Perhaps fear accounts for the discrepancy in memories of the weather that morning. Some would remember an overcast sky and choppy waves. Others, a glorious sunrise with a great red ball of sun appearing above the hills toward which they were headed and casting a glow over a tranquil East China Sea. One man saw a change from one to the other, reading into it the divine intervention for which all but the determinedly atheist were praying, just as Japanese were simultaneously praying for the same intervention on their side, remembering the divine wind that helped them defeat the seemingly all-powerful Mongols. American believers were comforted by the knowledge that April 1st happened to be Easter Sunday, a gloriously beautiful day, as one gratefully observed. Even the sea changed from a raging turbulence to a peaceful, lapping water. It was as though God came on Easter Sunday to lay everything in readiness before us. Amid the tension, few remembered the small gunboats that led the way in for the 1,000-odd landing craft, continuing to blanket the beach to the last moment with shells, rockets, and mortars. Claustrophobia and extreme vulnerability increased the pressure on the infantrymen in their own boats. Trained to dig in for protection, they felt helpless in the water, but the memory of the landing itself would be universally joyous. American intelligence hadn't even guessed that the landings would be virtually unopposed, even by artillery, for Japanese gunners had been ordered not to fire on the ships or landing craft for fear of revealing their positions and exposing them to devastating return fire. The Yahara Ushijima strategy was still to delay all serious resistance for a better time and place. Aerial photographs had pinpointed some of the menacing fortifications constructed above the landing beaches by Captain Kojo's battalion and others, but they did not reveal that almost all those positions were abandoned. The captain's men had been withdrawn more than 3 months earlier, shortly after Ushijima lost the 9th Division. Nor did they disclose the quality of the troops that had replaced the highly trained 24th Division. The single regiment now protecting the beaches was no more than hastily organized service troops, chiefly airfield construction crews, reinforced by ill-trained, half-armed Okinawan Home Guard units, including high school students who had never fired a shot. The relief of the American brass was expressed in a radio message from Admiral Richmond Turner, commander of the landing operation, to his boss, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet. Practically no fire against landing boats, none against ships. Troops advancing, standing up. The even greater relief of those making the swift advance turned from an immense sense of deliverance to bafflement, which Taylor Kennedy, the leader of a machine gun platoon, recorded in a battle diary. As our boats raced toward the rising sun, there was no firing. All was quiet except for the roar of the boat's motor and the slapping of the waves against the open boat, which drenched all of us with water and spray. About 50 yards from shore, the dancing craft slammed into shallow water. The ramp splashed down, and I ran out into knee-deep water, followed by a boatload of Marines. Still, there was no shooting. As I splashed toward the steep bank 50 yards away, I thought, they must be waiting to see the whites of our eyes scampering up the steep bank. I paused for a moment at the top, then plunged through a narrow row of bushes. There were the Japanese gun emplacements empty. Yes, empty. What kind of trick was this? The whole situation was eerie. A white Easter bunny hopped out of the brush and disappeared behind one of the gun emplacements. Yes, it was Easter Sunday on Okinawa too. We regrouped and moved quickly inland. Japanese soldiers were no less baffled. Believing their combined fleet to be intact and their planes lying in wait on the mainland and Formosa, they thought it simply incredible, as one exclaimed, that the American fleet appeared in broad daylight right before their noses. Looking at the fascinatingly beautiful battleships spitting fire, we still couldn't quite understand that they had come to kill us. Through the dense clouds of dust, debris and smoke left by the naval bombardment, they watched the landing in confusion and disbelief. From the transport ships that filled the ocean to the horizon, countless landing craft tracing white wakes set out, to disappear in the smoke. They kept coming relentlessly, in tens and hundreds, like arrows being shot in rapid succession and disappearing in the smoke. The vanguard reached the beach. Tanks, other vehicles and infantry ran up into Okinawan soil unharmed. What a great opportunity! Why didn't our Air Force come and attack them? Maybe they were waiting for all the transport ships to come and line up for us, but that's just what they did, and still our planes didn't appear. Finally, the enemy began landing in a leisurely manner, so to speak, and made our airfields into their unsinkable aircraft carriers. Thus the landing became more like a vast exercise than the real thing. Dashing from his landing craft, anxious and ready to fire, one Marine saw an earlier arrival sunning himself and flipping through a comic book. American fear shifted to amazement and euphoria. Remembering his wounding on Guam, a young company commander named Owen Stebbins felt an inner joy that he was still in one piece. Other veterans of previous landings wondered where and when the Japanese would spring their trap. The 1st of April was April Fool's Day as well as Easter Sunday. Still others grinned and yelped at their barely believable luck. Relief spread from jubilant infantrymen on the beaches to skeptical communications and intelligence personnel still on the ships. "I've already lived longer than I thought I would," exulted an army infantryman after he ran up the beach and made it to the top of a little hill. The opposition wasn't worse than at Iwo Jima, as expected. It was limited to occasional mortar shells and snipers' bullets, relatively no resistance at all. 40 miles to the south, the 2nd Marine Division was making a fake landing to deter Ushijima from rushing reinforcements to the real landing beaches. In that real operation, 4 divisions, 2 Army and 2 Marine, were landed at an 8-mile stretch of beach on the western East China Sea shore. Okinawa's width at that point, just south of her narrowest neck, is some 7 miles to the Pacific shore. On their way across, cutting the island in two, American units encountered 2 airfields, including Kadena, Captain Kojo's responsibility until the accidental explosion that drove him to a hospital. Both fields were less than half a mile from the landing beach, but American planners, knowing that half a mile was a considerable advance against Japanese island defenses, had scheduled their capture for the 3rd day. Defended only by a recently formed regiment of support troops, with little combat training and orders to retreat northward after delaying the enemy, they fell easily the first morning. One Marine noticed that nothing was alive, not a goddamn grasshopper or snake or fly on the way to the fields. Only a scattering of Japanese sheltering underground survived the tumultuous American bombardment. The defenders of the slightly more northern Yomitan airfield included Okinawan conscripts who had been issued uniforms but no arms. Shortly after it was secured, a neat green Japanese Zero appeared directly overhead, almost transfixing the Marines below with its red rising sunday. The pilot made a graceful landing, apparently with important papers from the mainland, then taxied across the field, climbed from his cockpit, and walked toward an airport building before realizing that the men gathered there were the enemy. They shot him as he tried to run back to his plane. Looking down at the body, a Marine noted, "There's always some poor idiots who doesn't get the word." The expected counterattack by a full division using parachute forces for the Japanese were known to favor the German doctrine of mobility and double envelopment didn't materialize. A correspondent who had covered previous landings wrote, "This is hard to believe. Colleagues still aboard flagships concurred. There must be some mistake." Bulldozers immediately began clearing the runways of wrecked Japanese planes and clever dummies of sticks, straw, and cloth. By nightfall, Marine strike planes began landing, the first to operate from official Japanese soil since the war began. That evening, a Marine artillery battery was fully ashore and ready to fire from a position near the beach. The men began digging in for the night, but found they were on solid coral that couldn't be dug. We had to hope for no incoming fire, and luckily there wasn't any. Americans who reconnoitered the empty Japanese fortifications, those excellently positioned caves, gun emplacements, and pillboxes dug over the course of 6 months by Captain Kojo's 24th Division realized they were even luckier than they'd thought. Despite the courageous feats of the Navy's underwater demolition teams, many landing craft were stranded for hours on coral reefs about 1,000 yards out, target practice range for enemy field artillery and heavy machine guns. The men had to transfer from the bouncing boats to Amtraks that rode out like sitting ducks. And despite all the weight of metal and explosive for softening up the invasion targets, despite that heaviest bombardment in the long Pacific campaign, only civilian buildings had been demolished. The defense works at the airfields and beaches were virtually intact. Their generally excellent condition testified to the unrealistic American value placed on mass fire of bomb and shell, as well as to Japanese skill in choosing and fortifying sites. If Iwo Jima hadn't lost the 9th Division, they would not have been abandoned. Tadashi Kojo would have led a charge with professional ruthlessness and a poised, unharmed battalion from his original position above the beach. The landing boats caught on the coral reefs would have become tombs. Once ashore, the invaders would have been the prey that Captain Kojo had envisioned. The hardest part of all was trudging in, an American remembered, using understatement to make his point. The water was waist deep. If we'd had to fight our way in, it would have been a job instead of a cinch. The American Army, designated the 10th, had 541,866 men at its disposal, more than the Okinawan civilian population at this time, almost 5 times more than the defending force. The smaller American assault force also represented a considerable numerical advantage over the Japanese, even beefed up by Okinawan conscripts. By nightfall, some 60,000 of the 10th Army's 183,000 assault troops, of which 154,000 were in the actual combat divisions, were ashore, together with much armor, artillery, and supplies, and 15,000 service troops. The U.S. Navy's most successful amphibious operation of the entire war was nearly complete. A historian recently summed up, American casualties were 28 killed, most victims of 2 kamikaze crashes on land, 27 missing, 104 wounded, a fraction of what had been expected. L-Day had indeed been near to love. Marine losses in particular were trifling compared with previous landings. 9 men killed, among them a 19-year-old medical corpsman named Truex, who, when the unit was forming up at Guadalcanal, had attached himself to a 30-year-old New Yorker named Peter Milo. Milo never knew the boy's first name but admired his sunny personality. Whoever wrote the story of Frank Merriwell must have imagined a man like Truex, broad of shoulder, handsome face with a real square jaw, and the temperament of a saint. After rushing forward to take Yomitan airfield, Milo and Truex were ordered to dig in and prepare for the expected counterattack. But like the Japanese soldiers who had dug the massive fortifications, Milo discovered the hardness of coral when his entrenching tool bounced right off it. He thought better of searching for the engineering battalion to ask for a pickaxe, because even the textbook American Landing had units scattered in the wrong places. You can't imagine what fouled up means until you make a landing on an enemy beach. Still, the former New York policeman was lucky enough to borrow a shovel. As he was using it, he heard a familiar voice claim next rights. Truex waited for the shovel near his jeep, with its large red cross. Hurrying there when he'd finished his foxhole, Milo bantered with his young friend about whose head was harder than the coral, then started back, laughing. He heard the roar of a motor and looked up to see his first Japanese plane, coming in low. He ran for all he was worth and was shocked to see 2 army soldiers crouching in his new foxhole just as he was about to leap in. The GIs had been driving up with supplies and took the nearest cover. Milo could only hit the deck and pray. 20 minutes later, someone told him Truex had driven over a landmine, probably while rushing to a casualty. What was left of his body had to be brought down in bloody parts from the roof of what was left of a native building. Okinawa's multitude of deaths soon put Milo into a kind of trance. It was as if I'd left my body and was looking at myself like in a movie. I just didn't feel anything. But he could not forget Truex. When a day was set aside for the troops to say so long to fallen comrades after the end of the campaign, he searched in cemeteries. He believed there may have been no grave because the body could not be identified. In any case, he left for Guam without having found it. At veterans' reunions 45 years later, Milo was still asking whether anyone remembered Truex's given name. One of the 104 men wounded was Alexander Franks, whose platoon had left its troopship for landing in a roaring amphibious tractor with its heavy smoke of exhaust. What are you thinking while you're waiting for your turn to land? During instruction, they tell you to relax then, but when you're in something like that, everybody's going to think his own thing, whatever most helps him cope with the stress. So what am I thinking? I'm thinking that I want to get out of the Amtrak. You're cooped up with everyone there and with your tension. You've psyched yourself up because you've got to psych yourself up, and you want to get out and relieve the tension. Besides, you can get seasick, or a mortar can hit the Amtrak and you're all gone. I'm also thinking, am I going to come out of this one alive? Is my buddy, sitting right there next to me, going to get killed, or am I? Yes, you actually think those thoughts while you sit there, trying to joke with your buddies, trying to do a lot of talking, although you don't remember what you've said the minute it leaves your mouth. That's what's on your mind. Am I going to get killed in the next few minutes, get crippled? This was my second landing. I'd also hit Guam, and I was just as scared. Maybe more so because on your first landing you don't really understand. It seems like an eternity, circling and circling out there beyond the range of the shore batteries, waiting for your turn to land. Am I going to come out of this alive? I prayed. Believe me, lots of guys did. You ask the Lord to help you and your friends come out whole. Yes, your friends too, because you depend on that man next to you. If you can't depend on him and he can't depend on you, you're both gone, you're nothing. When his Amtrak at last headed in, Franks was much relieved to see no incoming shells. He was even more relieved to see no one falling around him when the vehicle finally stopped, although a few men were killed elsewhere during their first minute ashore and he ran up the pebbly beach. He dashed up a little rise and dived to his stomach on top. When he got up to press on, a shell exploded just to his left. It killed the man next to him, a recent replacement in his squad, and knocked Franks back down. He realized he was hit when he couldn't get up again. His left arm and knee felt like a finger that's been banged with a hammer. It's an awful thing to say, but I think it was one of our own a shortfall because there were still no shells coming from the Japanese. That was the only one I saw. My first thought is, am I going to lose my leg? And then, I'm alive, and I'll be going home. I'm deeply sorry to leave my buddies. I'm deeply sorry for them, but there's nothing I can do for them anymore. That new guy right next to me, 2 feet away, is dead, and I'm still alive. Still alive. And after the shot of morphine from the corpsman, I realize my arm and leg are still on me, so I probably won't be a cripple. L-Day was almost unbearingly exciting for Masahide Ota, the 20-year-old knave of Kume Island who had been appointed one of the 3 adjutants to the principal of the normal school below Shuri Castle. Perhaps because it was assumed that the normal school, so close to 32nd Army's headquarters in the tunnel under the castle, must have been mobilized earlier. This was actually carried out only the day before the landing, March 31st. By that time, more than 20,000, mostly teenage Okinawans, had been taken into service with the Home Guard. Although not all the boys of the island's many middle schools were among the conscripted, The normal school's teachers and entire enrollment of 360 students were taken into the 1,500-boy corps called Blood and Iron Scouts for the Emperor. The top 22 students in the obligatory judo, kendo and karate as well as scholarship were formed into a subunit bearing the immensely proud name of a historical figure who had sacrificed his own life and his family's for the Emperor's protection. Those enviable ones, including the bright, diligent Ota, were assigned to staff intelligence at 32nd Army Headquarters. A rudimentary short pants uniform was distributed, but there was no time for any kind of real preparation. Despite the years of military training, the students hadn't even practiced firing small arms. But now, on the morning of the landing, the second-class privates were heady with the thrill of being near the highest-ranking army officers on an observation platform above a wall of Shuri Castle. Looking down at the huge enemy operation, the boys delighted in the idiotic massing of so many ships marked for the bottom. Ota's unqualified expectation of quick, total victory was further heightened when he saw the kindly, masterful General Ushijima calmly surveying the epic scene. The boys believed exactly what they'd been told, that Imperial General Headquarters had been clever enough to lure the large enemy force to this place in order to destroy it in one go. As one of Ota's teachers put it, the whole American fleet, with all its men and equipment, had been drawn into a noose that would now be deftly closed. Ota felt a surge of exhilaration as he observed the stirring spectacle of war below. What an honor it was to participate in the glorious task of rapidly liquidating the sinister foe. He itched for his first assignment for staff intelligence. Dick Whitaker was among the rich beneficiaries of the nearly unopposed landing. Had the Japanese met the assault force with the furious counterattack originally planned, he would have been rushed in to replace one of the profusion of casualties, with a good chance of being killed or badly wounded then and there. As it was, the first wave of American troops penetrated so fast and deep that by the time he arrived, in the third wave an hour later, although the waves often overlapped, the greatest need ashore was not more bodies but more material for the 20,000 already there. Their advance so far ahead of schedule caused an instant crisis in supplies. Whitaker's replacement draft was among 5,000 Marines formed into work details. Still untried in combat, he was an old hand at lifting and lugging. Floodlights were rigged on the long beachhead so that unloading from landing craft could continue throughout the night, except for relatively rare interruptions when the men took cover from Japanese scouting planes. Whitaker's detail also helped fashion an assortment of strewn metal, canvas and cardboard into a little shack city for some protection from the rain and sun between loads. However, nothing could help against an army of relentless fleas, much more formidable so far than the Japanese army. They didn't come to Okinawa to unload ships. They all knew the Marine Corps was invincible. Whitaker believed he was invincible too. Some of the older, married men would have been happy to stay where they were, but younger ones wanted off that goddamn beach. They wanted combat to pull their triggers, become heroes, grab some good Japanese souvenirs. On the fourth day, half a dozen of them took advantage of slack time to improvise a little scouting party. This was against regulations. No one in command would know where they were if they happened to be killed. But the ease with which the little nips were being pushed back kept death an abstraction. The patch of woods farther inland had been secured days before, cleaned up enough of the enemy for combat units to push on. But one of the party pointed to a small rise a few hundred yards from the beach. "Hey, get that!" Whitaker's first sight of a live Japanese soldier, any living Japanese, brought a rush of excitement. There was the object of all his training, the whole massive effort on the island. He joined the firing until the enemy's sloppy helmet disappeared over the ridge, then continued to see its image in his mind's eye like a titillating target, charging him up even further. The beach parties were broken up a few days later, and their men were trucked to frontline units as replacements, but Whitaker saw few more real targets even there. Most of his group was assigned to the 6th Division's 29th Regiment Battalion, he himself to 2nd Battalion F. Fox Company, which had advanced far north by the time he joined it. The company's fighting up there was almost over. American bullets now caused its worst wounds. An airstrike was requested one day when Whitaker's new platoon encountered a pocket of resistance on a mop-up patrol. The men were told to mark their own positions by making ground panels of ration boxes, ponchos, anything easily seen from above. Several F-4 us soon appeared. the celebrated corsairs that had already demonstrated their enormous value in the north, where Japanese artillery pieces fired once and pulled back into concealed emplacements on steep hillsides, making them almost unhittable by naval gunfire. The Corsair, which carried more armament than a B-29, may have been the best close ground support aircraft ever designed. The gull-winged Butte could circle for hours, then come in low and slow, not fast, high and inaccurate, like later jets to bomb or strafe as close as 200 yards to delighted friendly troops. Excellent coordination with ground forces, where observers operating down to the company level spotted for their strikes, made Marine Corsairs even more effective. But one splendid Corsair on this raid missed or misread the ground panels and strafed the wrong side. One Marine was killed, others wounded. Whitaker was too new to the company to know their names. It was also a new and an anguishing experience to be the target of one's own magnificent weapons, hugging the ground in terror with the rest of his platoon. Whitaker viewed the great Corsair as a savage monster spitting murderous fire. He would soon learn to add such agonizing mistakes to combat's other costs. No list has been compiled of men killed and wounded on Okinawa by own fire, but it would surely run to hundreds, perhaps thousands, many more than the number torn and blown apart by bulldozers, cranes, steam winches, and aviation fuel handled by young men in a necessary hurry, the industrial accidents of a huge, extremely hazardous enterprise run under extreme stress, with what otherwise would be called inordinate recklessness. No satisfactory trade-off was ever made between safety precautions and preparedness. The proportion of deaths grew as armies acquired heavier machinery, more volatile fuel, more deadly armament and powerful explosives. In the field it was impossible to have so many youths and enemy troops with so many weapons without constant accidents and mistakes. On Sugarloaf Hill, where Whitaker would face his worst days in about 3 weeks, a second lieutenant would lose a beautiful kid, a real fine, decent Marine, when a tank shell aimed at a Japanese target bounced off a tree stump and tore open the 18-year-old's chest. On Little Dihea Island, 50 miles north of Okinawa, Marines were killed by rocket fire from ships that didn't know they were on the beach, and a variety of American bullets, grenades, mortar shells, artillery shells, and even flamethrowers cut down American boys all over Okinawa. Horrible mistakes, without which a war can't be fought and whose number can't be fixed, because, as one veteran put it, combat is just too confusing for any kind of count of who killed whom. It could easily happen without anyone knowing. A peacetime terrorist action that takes a single precious life is rightly emblazoned on headlines and abhorred. Infinitely worse losses on Okinawa were never described in print, even to the families concerned, because few officers were willing to write that their men had fallen to own fire. Lieutenant David Curtin's summary is as accurate as any. We had more men killed by accidental fire than will ever be known.